Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. CTV News did a story this week on the provincial legislation that was designed to keep criminals from being able to impersonate police officers or to have replica vehicles or other equipment that resembled police equipment and vehicles. And the story was about how this legislation has yet to be enacted in Nova Scotia here nearly 2 years after the mass casualty incidents. And so I wanted to look into that. It was legislation, actually I hadn't reviewed this legislation before, and there's some very interesting elements to it. I think I know why the legislation is being held up, and I wanted to talk a little bit about those elements of it. So it's the always interesting topic of how a bill becomes a law. Well, this is called the Police Identity Management Act, and it has gone through the Provincial Legislature. And in the Legislature there's 3 readings, first, second, and third, during which the bill is studied, potentially amended, and ultimately passed by the Legislature. So that was done, in this case, in March of 2021, received a Royal Assent, which means it was signed by the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, the Honourable Art LeBlanc, in April of 2021. So again, nearly a year ago, getting close to a year, but it has not been enacted. Now, when legislation is passed and receives Royal Assent, sometimes there's a date in the legislation itself that tells you that it'll be enacted on a certain date. Sometimes it's the date that it was signed by the Lieutenant Governor, and then in other cases such as this, it becomes a law when Cabinet Cabinet proclaims it. So it's a simple process in some ways that there's a Cabinet meeting and they issue a proclamation order. But in this case it wasn't done under the previous Liberal government, and it hasn't been done under the new PC government. Now, that is not to say that there is nothing preventing somebody from impersonating a police officer. There's provincial legislation and the criminal code. The provincial legislation is the Nova Scotia Police Act, and Section 69 of that Act, which is going to be repealed and replaced by the new legislation, says that no person or organization shall use the uniform, insignia, vehicle markings, or symbols of a police department, and the minister can order users to stop. And then the criminal code, section 130, says that anyone who falsely represents themselves to be a peace officer is committing a criminal offense. Anybody that uses the badge, articles of uniform, or equipment. And the maximum penalty for doing so is up to 5 years in jail. It's a hybrid offense, so it can be prosecuted as a summary conviction offense, but it can be treated quite seriously. But this legislation would add to that. Now, in the Police Act, it talks about individuals using equipment or uniforms, police vehicles. The Police Identity Management Act would take that a step further and prevent not only the use of it, but the possession of it by those that aren't authorized. And there are exceptions made now for, of course, for police officers, but also if anybody's a mechanic working on a vehicle, a police vehicle, of course, can have it in their possession. People that make the uniforms for the police, of course, they're allowed to have them. If there's a TV show being filmed in Nova Scotia, well, they can use police vehicles as well if it's suits the dramatic purposes of what they're doing. But they must be authorized. So there's some rules and regulations covering how that can operate. So there's a little more detail than the existing Police Act. So that all seems quite reasonable. But then there's some other provisions that I think are behind the reason why this has not yet been enacted. Section 11 of the Act says that every police agency in Nova Scotia must, not may, but must, have what's called an asset management and disposal policy. That means they have to have a process for tracking any issued police clothing, articles, badges, insignia, anything else, and that anything that's lost, stolen, or damaged needs to be tracked, noted, and documented. Now, to me, this alone is probably a big part of the reason that the implementation of this act has been delayed. Every police force would need to comply with that before the legislation is enacted, or else they'd be in violation of it. Now, there's other provisions in there that I think probably deserve a little more scrutiny. I'm surprised this wasn't brought up when it was first drafted and passed, but there's a notice of violation issued if somebody is discovered to have these items. But if the person immediately forfeits the items, in other words, hands them over to the police, vehicle, the clothing, uniform, whatever it is, then no prosecution may be commenced. In other words, you get caught, you're found to have these items that you're not supposed to, well, instead of being prosecuted, if you just turn them back over to the police, then you avoid prosecution. Actually, it says no prosecution, so it makes me wonder whether that would also preclude a criminal code prosecution. And if that is the intention of the legislation, that could be an issue too, because there's federal and provincial jurisdictional issues there, and I think the federal criminal code would supersede a provincial act. But certainly if you were being charged under that provision and you read that no prosecution may be commenced, you would rely on that to prevent a criminal code prosecution as well. There's another section that's similar to that, and it says whenever there's a seizure of these items, a police officer within 10 days is obligated to report that to a justice, unless the person turns the items back in. And I question why this would be the case. To me, it would be more appropriate to have some discretion for the police officer if it's the circumstances seem to warrant, a report to a justice. If that provision is even going to be kept, I'm not sure how important it is. But certainly on the earlier section that I talked about, being able to lay charges in the first place, well, why wouldn't there be some discretion on the officer's part to be able to do that, as they are in every other case? Just imagine, the shooter in this case, and the mass shooter, being able to just say, well, or somebody in those circumstances, well, here you go. I'm giving you the vehicles, I'm giving you the uniforms back, and then no prosecution for those offenses. You would never see that in, a criminal code theft charge or a drug possession charge, that as long as the person hands things back, then no prosecution. There's another part of it as well that I found a little curious. It's kind of similar to firearms criminal code prosecutions in the way they work, but if the person is not charged within the first 6 months, then the police officer needs to apply to the court to get an order to be able to dispose the items. Well, the only way you wouldn't be charged within those first 6 months is if you had agreed to either hand them over and then agreed to allow the police have them. So it's curious as to why that extra procedure would be necessary. So that's probably something, if there's going to be any second look at this legislation, any amendments made, that would certainly be an area to examine. The penalty provision of the legislation seems rigorous. There's a $10,000 maximum fine for an individual, 3 months in jail maximum. For corporations, it's $25,000 fine, and any director or owner of the corporation who's found to be directly responsible can be subject to the individual fines and jail terms as well. So, there's some discussion in the newspaper article about how they have to work on regulations and there's things to do. Yes, in the Act itself, there is the minister is authorized to make regulations to detail further what items a police officer may have that a person's not supposed to possess. Other identifying markings or identifying other people that are able to possess these items aside from police officers. But to me, the legislation is sufficiently detailed in its current form that it could be passed, except for these provisions that I think deserve at least a second look and should likely be amended before it's passed. Now, the provision in particular about each police agency needing to have this bureaucracy, this process for tracking issued articles, that could probably be hived off and made part of what the minister can, an area where the minister can enact regulations at a later date, get the legislation passed in the spring session of the legislature, which is going to be coming up in the next month and a half or so, and then we would have this legislation. It's more rigorous or more vigorous than the existing Police Act provision, and then if the bureaucratic the creation of the internal bureaucracies for these police agencies is taking too much time, well, that can wait. So we'll see what happens with that, if the new government decides to pass the legislation as it is, or takes another look at it and perhaps does some amending in the spring session of the legislature. But anyway, the article came out this week. I thought it was a good catch by CTV News that had not been enacted. It was something I hadn't noticed myself, but I was glad that they did so that I could take a look at it and bring these thoughts to you. So I hope you found that interesting, and thank you for watching again, and thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.